In the last 30 years or so, according to legal, criminological, and journalistic literature, the United States criminal justice system has become one of the most punitive systems in the world, and perhaps the most punitive in the West. The most common ground for this assertion is that the U.S. imprisons more people per capita than any other country in the world, and we also use the death penalty. And we do know that at least among Western democracies, executions are no longer carried out. But the question would be, does this give us enough ground to characterize the United States criminal justice system as the most punitive? What would be the most effective methodology for validating or rejecting any claim of punitiveness? Unfortunately, the most prevailing assumptions of state punitiveness suffer from two shortcomings. First of all, they rely on very few indicators of punitiveness, largely focusing on the death penalty, mandatory sentencing laws, or incarceration policies. But even more, most arguments basically overlook remarkable variation in state and regional level variation in criminal justice policies in the United States. And it seems to me that it is essential to explore this variation that exists in the United States before we rush into cross-national comparisons. And it is also important to take into account various aspects of punitiveness, because this is in fact multidimensional, multifaceted construct. And after building this measurement, run cross-national comparisons. As I mentioned, most claims about American punitiveness rely on statements, on arguments that the U.S. imprisons more people than other countries, per capita, of course, and we use the death penalty. However, there have been a number of researchers, scholars that have made further steps. For instance, Michael Tonry argues that the U.S. criminal justice system is more punitive than average European criminal justice system because, number one, we use the death penalty, we have mandatory sentencing laws that are very inflexible, we use life imprisonment without possibility of parole, and we do not respect inmates. Also, we have this wonderful scholar, James Whitman, who in his book, Harsh Justice, says that we apply very inflexible doctrine of criminal law when we arrest people. And we can just decriminalize many offenses. And if we arrest these people, we should treat them with respect. These are all brilliant ideas, I thought, and they contributed enormously to the development of my thesis. However, they have not been explored empirically. One doesn't need much administrative data when it comes to maybe comparison of the use of death penalty in US versus Europe, but administrative data is necessary when it comes to comparison of average prison sentences, for instance, which shows variations in among jurisdictions very clearly. What I did in my book is that I developed a 44 variable measure of state punitiveness that takes into account indicators of the death penalty, life imprisonment without possibility of parole, disenfranchisement laws, mandatory sentencing laws, including three strikes laws, of course, sex offender registration notification laws. Also, I focused on comparison of incarceration rates, both stock and flow incarceration rates, but also average prison sentences imposed and actually served. And there were also variables of juvenile justice, conditions of detention, and arrest for some type of crimes that are called moral offenses, such as prostitution or the use of marijuana. So I pretty much took all of these 40 variables based on the review of the existing literature and put them together into one scale. Then using various data, particularly data that come from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, I populated the indicators and created the continuum of U.S. states in terms of punitiveness. So this method really showed that there is a significant variation among U.S. states and particularly U.S. regions that is remarkable and that is worthy of exploration. There are a number of significant findings, I thought. First of all, the most important finding probably to me was that the measurement I developed really works. It is possible to populate this measurement, and it tells us a lot about the criminal justice policies and the variations amongst the jurisdictions. On the practical side, I also found out that, and documented, not only found out but also documented, that American South is extremely punitive. North is relatively non-punitive, and Midwest and West fall somewhere in between in the continuum of punitiveness. I also found out that Florida is the most punitive American jurisdiction, and Maine is the least punitive American state. But another significant finding was that using this instrument, I was able to challenge widespread view of American punitiveness. I was able to show that American criminal justice policies are not uniformly as harsh as many critics argue, that it's important, essential to take into account significant differences among American states and regions when we talk about state punitiveness. The next steps are many. First of all, I'm very intrigued with the idea what causes the variation in state punitiveness. And I'm in the process of collecting data, various socioeconomic and political characteristics of each state residents, such as population turnover, median household income, predominant religion and religiosity, which means how often people go to church, level of education, whether residents voted Republican or Democrat during the last gubernatorial or presidential election, and number of other variables, and connect this with the punitiveness scale. So I can get some sense what are these factors, socioeconomic and political factors, that I associated with increased or lowered levels of punitiveness. And even more ambitious next step would be to conduct a similar research in Europe, and I'm in the process of reaching out to my colleagues in Europe who are also fascinated with the idea of punitiveness. And then once we have similar data collected in Europe, carry out a cross-national comparison on both sides of Atlantic. So I just want to make sure that we'll be comparing perhaps most punitive aspects of the U.S. criminal justice system with the most punitive aspects of European jurisdictions, and then the least punitive aspects of U.S. criminal justice system with the comparable jurisdictions in Europe. In other words, instead of treating American criminal justice system and European criminal justice systems as two homogeneous phenomena, one has to take into account the variation and compare most punitive aspects with the most punitive aspects, and so on. Thank you.